Okay, so hello everybody. I'm Bailey. I am the vice president of the Code Education Club.
I'm AJ. I'm the secretary of the Codeducation Club.
I'm Rachel. I'm the president.
And I am Kathleen, the outreach coordinator.
Well, we're going to start off with downloading the application that we will need in order to work today. So it's called Atom, so ATOM. You can just type in Atom. I put in Atom JS installation because we're doing JavaScript. And it's the second one right here, the atom.io. So it'll automatically pick up on what kind of computer you have. So then just hit the download button. I have the Atom installation downloaded. So once your guys' installation is downloaded, go ahead and run it. I'm just going to take you through the installation process. It's very easy. This screen is just going to pop up. It just says Atom is being installed. And then once it's done, it just pops up on its own. It's probably the easiest installation process I've ever done. All right. So my Atom is finished. You can close out of all of these parts. I'm gonna do a new file. We're gonna start off with like the most basic HTML that there is, but this is the basic HTML document that we're just gonna do. Since we're just strictly going over the JavaScript, I wanna kind of keep it to that. The majority of the time just is like a little tip. When you're doing web development, your main page is always usually going to be called index.html. So let's go over just a couple of like the more basic things. There's two ways that you can write JavaScript when it comes to HTML. There's inline JavaScript and then a separate file. We're going to be doing inline JavaScript. So inline JavaScript is where you're in the middle of an HTML document, just like this one, and you use the tags script. And this tag that I just wrote is the opening part of it. So when the computer reads from top to bottom, it knows when to start reading in JavaScript. And when you want to close the JavaScript, just the same as all these other tags, you're gonna rewrite it, but with a /. The first thing we're gonna do is we're gonna be going over the difference between console.log and document.write. So there's two different ways of writing things and printing them to the screen in JavaScript. The first one is console.log. I'm just going to call a variable named x, and then I'm going to print it. So console.log x. This is how you print the x. And then there's document.write. And you always want to remember to use semicolons after every line, so then the computer knows like, okay, it's time for me to read. Separate thing. So what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to save as. I just have mine in a folder called JS. You can make any folder on your desktop. You could do whatever you want. And then I put in index.html. I like using Chrome personally. So when I press open, you can see it opens to Edge. I don't want to open Edge, I want to open to Chrome. So I'm gonna right click on it, press open with, and then Google Chrome. And it'll bring me to this page. So if you're using Chrome, similar to me, the way you're gonna see the console, I told you there's two different ways of bringing something to a page. Console is going to be, you click on these three dots in the top right corner, you're gonna put more tools and then developer tools. And it's gonna bring you to this console, or it might say elements. Click on the second tab up at the top that says console. So basically, if I get rid of the document.write, you'll see that the 5 on the left side, when I refresh it, goes away because the document.write is the one that shows up in the actual document, while the console.log is the one that shows up in the console, which is in the back portion of the website. And if I switch it, or I do document.write x, and then I get rid of the console.log, and I save it, and I refresh the page, the opposite happens. I put document.write, so the 5 shows up on the document, but there's nothing in the console because I got rid of the console.log. So those are the two ways that you can write in JavaScript. There's a couple different ways that you can declare a variable. Variables are things that you can store data in, or elements or different things like that. So there's 3 different ways. There's var, which stands for variable. There's let, which is just let. And then there's const, which stands for constant. So the difference between the 3, and I'll show you the difference, is variables can be changed. So when you declare a variable, like how I did earlier with variable x equals 5, I will show you on the console that you can change it. It's going to first write 5 because the first time you print it, I have the variable x equals 5. And then I'm going to change the variable x equals 7. And you'll see once I print x equals 7 out, it has changed on the console. So it'll print out both because I asked it to. So see, the first one was 5, and the second one was 7 because I changed it. But for example, constant x equals 5, I'll print that out, has to constantly stay the same. So if I try to change it to x equals 7, you'll see what the console puts out. It puts out an error message. So watch the 7, it's going to change to an error message. Assignment to constant variable, index.html, line 15. Line 15, I assigned it to 7, but I'm going to get an error because it's a constant and it can't be changed from 5. I'm going to go over some conditionals. So conditionals are like equal, plus, divided by, those types of things. So there's different kinds of equals in coding. There's equal, equal, and then there's equal, equal, equal. So the difference between the two is when you put x equals 5 and then y equals 5. So the variable y is going to be what we call a string because it's written in those quotation marks. When I do x equals y, this one's a variable and this one's a string. The word one, like O-N-E, is different than the actual number 1, right? But when I assign it using the 2 equal signs, it's going to come up as true because the 2 equal signs, they do type conversions. It'll read 5 as the number because let's just say it's a little smarter. But when you use the 3, it's going to take it literally. So it's going to come out as false because, like I said, the string is not equal to the variable. So see, the first one comes out as true and the second one comes out as false. Singular equal sign is for declaration purposes, where I'm declaring y equals 5, where x equals the number 5. This is the opposite symbol of this one. I like to think of it as not equal to. For example, this came out as true because x does equal y in the type conversion. But if I put an exclamation point, that's going to change it to false. You're going to always want to read from left to right. So this one is greater than, so x is greater than y. And then there's x is less than y. And then there's x is less than or equal to y. X is greater than or equal to y. Those are pretty standard, pretty easy. Everybody knows that. Everybody learned that in 3rd grade. And then the last ones, the conditions that I'm going to be going over is, this is an or symbol. So it means this or that. Usually you're going to want to write it in something like, if x equals 5 or y equals 7, then whatever you want to put in there. This is also just an example of an if statement. It's basically saying like, if this, then do this. And this is where you would put the code. So that was the or, this one. But then there's also the and sign. And there's just a regular and, one and then there's 2 ands. So similar to kind of how it is with the equal signs, there are differences between these two. So the one and compares both sides to determine the truth. So let's say I wrote console.log 7 equals 2, which obviously everybody knows that's not true, and 7 equals 7, and 7 equals 7. This would come out as false, but when reading from left to right, because there's only one and sign, it would read all of these before determining that it's false. Whereas if I used a double and sign, 7 equals 2, and 7 equals 7, and 7 equals 7, it wouldn't have to read these two before determining it's false. So it's just a little bit of like a faster way for the machine to be like, okay, well, The first one's false, so the rest has to. So here's the difference between a let and a variable. So really the only difference between a let and a variable is that basically like where the data can be found or accessed. So the let is a data variable that gives you access only locally. So when you see these curly brackets and you see something like let x equals 5, the variable x can only be accessed between these two. So if I was to call x and say console.log with x, I could only do this in between these curly brackets. I couldn't do it if, for example, if I went here, that would give me an error. But I could do that if I used bar. So another really kind of cool thing about JavaScript and a lot of programming languages, but specifically JavaScript, is that there's a lot of predefined functions. So functions are basically like a slice of code that's written that you can take and then call it, and it'll basically read it each time it's called. So calling is basically saying, like in a piece of code saying, okay, stop, I want you to read this part again. So one function that is kind of fun is called, just another thing to say about predefined functions is you don't have to write out the entire function. It's already written in the code. You can call it whenever, and you don't have to have anything saying like this is what that function is. Whereas in other functions, you do have to write out and basically say what it is. Document.write, like our printing, then you can put date inside of it. Now it shows the time and the date because that's predefined in JavaScript. And then the last thing I'm going to go over before giving it on over to AJ for the little advanced portion, document.GetElementById. And so basically what this is it technically is kind of predefined function. I'm going to give you an example, and this one's kind of like a little fun one. I'm going to change the color of a sentence. So let's make a little paragraph in HTML, and I'm going to say, this will change colors. So since this is outside of the script, it's not going to be read as JavaScript. So inside of the script, we want to write button, which basically says like this is going to be a button. Button is a tag, script is a tag, body is a tag, HTML is a tag. All of these, it's a pretty common thing in HTML to kind of determine what parts you're looking at. So onClick is another predefined function in JavaScript. It's basically like when you press this button, my function is going to occur. When you want to write a function, you just write the word function. How fun is that? And I'm going to do my function because that's what I wrote up here. Variable x equals document.getElementById. And then I'm just going to say demo x.style.color, which basically just tells it what color we want it to be. So this is the ID. We want to put it in the paragraph and say ID equals demo. So that's a way of telling the code like, hey, get this element and assign it to X and change it to the color red. And so it says, okay, well, I'm this ID. This is what's going to change to red on this button. All right, let's switch to AJ now.
All right, so we're gonna do a little change of pace here. If you guys want to come over here, just go to this code button right here and then press download zip. And then you'll get to see the zipped up version of everything that's in this GitHub directory. Go ahead and click on that. On Windows, come up here and press extract. On a Mac, you should just be able to double click the file and then just extract it to a folder. You can just come over here up in file, and then you click add project folder. And then up in add project folder, you just kind of navigate to where it was on your computer. Here you go, the JavaScript Workshop Master. And then you just kind of press select folder. And then now on the left side, you will see these files. So you can kind of just ignore the README and the styles.css. Those are just things for READMEs for GitHub, and then the styles.css is styling for the page. We have this HTML file here. That's kind of what we're starting with. This is like this little starter project we're giving you guys. Pop it up into a web browser. It just looks like a basic form. We're gonna add some fun stuff to it with JavaScript. Just click on it right now, type in some words. Nothing happens when you press login. So now we'll just go ahead and start writing some code here. So kind of what Bailey was just talking about with those document.getElementByIds, we're actually gonna do a lot with those. We're gonna use consts for ours. The first thing we're gonna wanna get here is gonna be the username field. So if we just go ahead and do username equals document.getElementById. ID and then username. So we'll go ahead and put this on username input, just that way we're not kind of flashing with the variables we're going to use later. And then now if we come here, we can do username inputs. And what this kind of does is we have this named variable here that's username input, right? And one of the actual functions that inputs have in JavaScript is that you can add event listeners to them. That means we can do all kinds of different things. We're going to add an event listener for changing here, which means that every time this input changes, we're going to do this. We're going to do what's called an arrow function here. This is essentially the same thing as writing this, and I will show you that in a second here. So let me go ahead and write. Then we can just do password. And we can do password input dot event listener, and then do change. And then this is exactly the same thing as if I did this. So kind of what Bailey was just saying before, this code right here is exactly the same as this code right here. It's just a different way. It's really personal preference. I like the way this one looks, honestly, but it's totally up to you. This add event listener thing here, this function takes 2 arguments, which is what these are called. The first argument is the event you want to change on, which is just a string. So if you want this event listener to fire on every key up, every key down, etc., you would put it in there. I'll put the key up in here real quick. That would actually give you the same input as change. It would just fire every time you press tab as well. On a website where you have a lot of things going on, especially if this is sending requests to your server to do other things with this event listener, then you definitely don't want to have it do it on change, because then you're firing one too many requests and that could cause a big bottleneck, you know? So we're going to do what's called getting the value of this. I'm going to make a new variable, and this time we're going to use let because this one is going to change. So we use let username equal an empty string here, and then let password equal empty string. But actually what we're going to do here, we're going to do this instead, because this is something that's super important in JavaScript. It's a huge part of JavaScript, and that is JSON, which is called JavaScript Object Notation. That basically lets us combine this username and password into one variable, which we're going to do let, we'll call it form data equals, and then this is the notation here. So you have what's called a key value pair for each one of these data points. The key is the thing on the left side of this colon, and then the value is the thing on the right side. So in this case, we're starting off with the username of just being empty and the password just being empty as well. And that is exactly the same as writing this, but to access this data, instead of just doing username equals this, we would do this instead. We're going to do form data username equals new value. And that is the same. It might seem like it's more verbose, more code to write, but it's better to keep related data things like this in one object. It shortens up your code. It also makes it really easy for other developers to look at your code and see, okay, like they were thinking we got the username and password go together, you know, so it makes sense to keep it in a form data variable rather than them looking at your variables and looking through all the variables and saying like username 13, you know, if you have a bunch of different things called, because here we have username input, right? And username input could easily be confused with username the value, right? But in this case, we have form data, which is very obviously like that is what's the data that's the user has entered into the form. So we'll go ahead and just delete that code because we don't need that. Leave this blank for now. Now on the event listener here, we're going to go ahead. So every time this input changes, we're going to want the username in this form data to be what the new value is. So we do form data username equals event. And then the event here, when we subscribe these event listeners to these inputs, they send event objects to the function here that we have, which is called a callback. The data that's being sent to this callback has a bunch of different things about it, but what we want out of this data is the target. So if we do target, that actually gives us the HTML element that is being listened to. So in this case, we're actually getting like an instance of this element, which allows us to access the value of it. So in this case, we do event.target.value. That actually gives us the value that is in the input currently. The same thing with here, form data.password equals event.target.value. And we can do the same code here twice, and it actually will get different things because in this case, the event is the password listener, and then in this case, the event is the username listener. So those are actually completely different instances of the same thing, but we can type the same code here. So we can actually move this over. We'll call this username update handler, and then we'll just do const username handler equals that, and that will be our code. It works a little bit differently on everybody's computers here. It kind of just depends on the browser. Some browsers behave differently, but I guess on this browser, when I tab off of it, it changes. So that's fine. So here, we're declaring this function up here in this case, and we're just referencing it here. And notice that we didn't actually give it parentheses like this. If we were to do that, that would actually execute the function when the document first loads, then after that, do nothing. So it kind of defeats the purpose of us using this to subscribe an event listener because it would just run it once and then nothing would happen after that. The reasoning for that, there's a very detailed description I could give you, but yeah, I'm sure you guys don't have the hours for me to give you that description. So I'll just say that because there's parentheses, it actually calls the method and then runs it. But without that, it is a reference. It's called a pointer to this function, but otherwise it does not do that. So we can remove these console.logs. We're not going to use those. But yeah, so now we have these handlers. We have a handler here that's out of line, which is we have up here, and then we have an inline handler down here. And then if you wanted to do a similar thing here, I'll kind of just write it down and then comment it out. But if you wanted to do using the function notation instead of the const function, that is how you would do that. That is all for that. And now we have these username update handlers and the password update handlers, and we are storing them in this object we have now. So now the last thing we need to do is just print it out when the form submits. So we can add another event listener here. We'll do this all in one line this time. Document.getElementById, and then we'll do form, because that is the actual form object. Then we'll do add event listener. And then this time we're going to do submit. So submit, we have this event listener again. We're going to do an inline one just to save space. Now, so we have to do what's called preventing the default, because by default, this form, when I submit it, if you look closely, it's hard to see because it happens so fast. And if I click the submit form, it refreshes the whole page, which we don't want to do because JavaScript, when you refresh the page, loses what's called state. And state is what actually holds the information that's in our variables. And if we refresh the page, we lose all of that data that we had, which means that we aren't actually able to see the data that comes out of the form. So that kind of defeats the whole purpose of this. So we're kind of doing what's called preventing default, which stops it from submitting the form in this case, and just will leave the page as it is. So if we refresh the page now and then submit it, nothing happens. So that's good, because now we're going to have that actually grab this paragraph right here, and we're going to have it put the text from our form into there. To do that, we're just going to go ahead and right below this, we're going to do const output box equals document get element by ID, and then we'll do output text. And then, so that's that. We have that. Now we can do output box dot, know what's called inner HTML. So inner HTML basically just sets whatever we set this equal to. So if I set this equal to hello, that literally will put hello between these tags on the web page that gets outputted. So what I just wrote is exactly what this thing will do for me. So this allows us to put text dynamically into there. So we say we want to put username entered like that, and then plus form data dot username plus, and then we'll have a break tag here. And I'll explain all this in a second here. Password entered, and then plus form data dot password. That will then fill in the thing for us. Kind of what happens here is we have this inner HTML thing. Like I said, it just puts this text between there. So what we have here is we have text that I entered myself. So this is just hard-coded text here. It will then print out that. And then this plus here is what's called a concatenation. So this allows me to string together all these different variables. So I have what's a static string here, which kind of just is this hard-coded text, like I said. But then after that, I have this form data.username, which is dynamically entered text that you typed in. So this kind of adds them together. So it'll have a space here, and then it'll have the value that's in this variable in another space. And this VR tag is just literally like pressing enter on your keyboard, essentially. Breaks to a new line. And then the same thing here with the password. Just a password entered, colon, and then now the data you entered in the password. And if we go ahead and save that, if we come back over here, refresh this page real quick, we'll throw in like username and test password. And if we submit it, you can see now we have username entered as that, and the password entered as that. And that's that. So hopefully that made sense to everybody. The question was, how secure is this page, by the way? Typically, the front end stuff is not secure. When it comes to sending the data from this front end to a back end, then I would want to start locking things down to make sure that people can't start sending like phony requests to my server, or can't intercept the data that you're sent to me. So like making sure that this gets encrypted as soon as it goes off your browser, and making sure it's encrypted before it gets sent out. Because if I'm sending out plain text, usernames, and passwords, that's horribly insecure. It's stuff like that.
The login page. So this is obviously my super secure password. So this is where you would find all of the passwords and usernames. And so for example, on this website that I'm building, you can see when you go into users, you saw that my password was 3 letters. This is what it shows up like in the database because it's encrypted and it's hashed, which that's basically the method of encryption that it uses. I am so happy that you guys were able to attend. If you're not a part of our Facebook group, request it so then you can get exclusive access to all of the things that we are doing in this club and all of the information that we're giving out. I hope you guys had a fun time.
Thank you guys so much for coming.